Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking all about Dreadnoughts and how you can deal with them on the tabletop. This is one of the most requested topics that you guys have asked me to talk about, so I thought I'd do a video about it. In this video, we are going to cover what Dreadnoughts do and why they're so good. We're going to touch also on the March of the Ancients Rite to War, which is a very contentious topic. We're going to talk about how to deal with different types of Dreadnought, and also some Legion-specific tips on dealing with Dreadnoughts as well. But before we do that, if you enjoy the channel, please do like and subscribe. And during this episode, if you've got any comments at all, or you've got any feedback on the episode, please do leave me a comment down below on YouTube. And now on with the show. So why this video? Well, this is really for three reasons. So for people who feel like they're maybe not having fun games when they're playing against Dreadnoughts, this is going to show you some ways in which you can deal with those Dreadnoughts so you can, not have your games feel like your games are being ruined by them. It's also for people who just want to learn how to deal with Dreadnoughts in general. So whether you're having a fun game or not, maybe you are enjoying your games, you're just losing. It's just for you to understand some ways in which you can think about dealing with those things on the tabletop. And lastly, for people who've maybe not played or not played against Dreadnoughts yet, but have read online lots of comments about Dreadnoughts being too good, this will hopefully show you that you can deal with them, that there are ways to play around them and still have great games regardless of what your opponent's using, even if that includes Dreadnoughts. So, which Dreadnoughts are we talking about when we're talking about Dreadnoughts? Well, Contemptors and Dreadnought Dreadnoughts are basically the same. So they have the same toughness profile. They have a very similar sort of weapon damage output and profile for their points. So they're roughly equivalent. Also variants such as the Incendious Blood Angels Dreadnought as well. Very sort of similar in profile. Leviathan Dreadnoughts are tougher and do have different weapon profiles, so they are a bit more offensive, but they also tend to be shorter range. But the same advice pretty much applies, and I'll call out where the differences with Leviathans are as we go through the video. Marigal Dreadnoughts and Wordbearers as well, very similar again, bit tougher, lots better in melee, but they're pretty much similar in terms of what the advice means. And also, if you're using the expanded units PDF, the Castroferrum Dreadnoughts are kind of relevant to this. They're much easier to deal with, being a little bit tougher, a bit smaller, a bit less good at things. They're less of a sort of problem unit for most people, I think, but similar basic advice in this video applies when dealing with them as well. And even though they are cheaper and smaller, they are also very good for their points. So the basics of Dreadnoughts that we're talking about are they got a 2+ save, a 5+ invulnerable save, and about 6 to 8 wounds as well. Their ballistic skill and weapon skill 5, which is very good. They carry roughly 3 to 5 heavy weapons worth of guns in equivalent terms, or up to about 8 for Leviathans if you double gun them. They do have some of the most powerful melee weapons in the game, being high strength, low AP, generally brutal as well, so causing multiple saves, and striking at full initiative as well, so generally 4. Or you can mix both of those things too on Dreadnoughts, which makes them quite versatile. They also do have some extra weapon systems depending on the Dreadnought, so the Dreadnought brings a really good pin and missile launcher. The Leviathan will come with some heavy flamers and maybe a Phosphex discharger as well. And they generally run about 200 to 300 points, which is ultimately one of the reasons Dreadnoughts are so good, is because they're quite aggressively costed for the total package of what they bring. So what does that mean? Well, it means that Dreadnoughts are tough for their point cost, and that is one of their main, if not their main selling point. They're just very tough. They're almost immune to small arms fire, so unlike Terminators where you can maybe spray them down with lots of bolter shots, it's very hard to do with a toughness 7 model. If you are going to shoot them with things like las cannons, they've got a 5+ invulnerable save, which is also very good. Melter, one of the standard vehicle killing weapons, only wounds them on a 3 or a 4 if you're Leviathan. And most of the benefits of vehicles, like being fearless, immune to pinning, for example, are there in Dreadnoughts, with none of the drawbacks of vehicles, i.e. sometimes randomly exploding from a single las cannon shot. They also do have good range damage output for their points if you want them to, so you can bring a Contemptor with 4 las cannons, for example, which is pretty good. But even though they're ballistic skill 5, That's not necessarily amazing for 220 points. There's a lot of ways to get a lot more effective guns for a lot less points, so really you're paying for their toughness combined with the guns that they bring. It also means that Dreadnoughts can be very versatile, so bringing a good gun like a Gravis Melter Cannon or a Gravis Las Cannon as well as a Fist means they can deal with multiple threats, although it means they're less good against each type of threat. They can be great in combat as well, so particularly if you give them a Chain Fist and a Gravis Power Fist, Weapon Skill 5, Striking at Normal Initiative, High Strength Brutal, 4 attacks, 5 on the charge, is a very powerful profile that will give even most elite Terminators a run for their money. They are mobile as well, so they can move and shoot their weapons, and they are also a denial unit, which means that you can't just ignore them in all scenarios and works very well with their survivability. And before we continue, just a little note on the March of the Ancients Rite of War, which allows you to bring lots of Dreadnoughts, including in your troop slots and also making them scoring and line units as well, and also just spamming units in general, which is easy to do with Dreadnought Talons, letting you bring multiple in one elite slot. Dreadnoughts are clearly one of the more efficiently costed units in the game, and you can spam them, or you can bring lots of them to have a powerful army. That's an undeniable fact. And if you bring more and more of something, and you're playing a spammy army where you're bringing lots of Dreadnoughts, or maybe mostly Dreadnoughts, you are effectively playing a competitive list, accidentally or otherwise. And if you're going to be playing a competitive list, it is expected that your opponent's going to bring one as well, in which case the advice in this video is less relevant because you're playing to the top end of your abilities. But if you're doing that and your opponent isn't bringing a competitive list, then whether it's Dreadnoughts or something else, if you're bringing those type of lists, you're mismatched anyway. And so the advice that we're going to talk through is kind of less relevant. When you're playing a game, you need to think about what you're bringing to it, no doubt. And this goes particularly for Horus Heresy. Now, there's nothing wrong with playing competitive games, but equally, if you are going to play a competitive game, you do need to be making sure that your opponent is expecting the same type of thing, or basically neither of you, or maybe one of you, is just going to have fun. But all that said, despite the reputation that Dreadnoughts have got, do remember that there are other powerful things in the game as well. There are lots of units in this game that are very, very good compared to some other units in the game. So there's lots of ways to build very powerful armies. So whilst it is fine to say to someone, look, I don't want to play against your 8 Dreadnoughts, if you then go and plonk down 3 units of Knight Cenobium in Land Raiders, you've probably just done the same thing, except you've done it without Dreadnought, you've done it with a different unit instead. So just bear that in mind. Bear in mind that the advice in this video is super useful for people who are struggling dealing with an opponent bringing Dreadnoughts or multiple Dreadnoughts. That is fine. If you're going to bring tons and tons of them, no advice is going to change how good they are, and that's a completely different type of game, essentially. Okay, so with all that established, how do we deal with Dreadnoughts? Well, firstly, you can take Dreadnoughts too. So every army has got access to Dreadnoughts, and there is some level of balance in that. Now, that doesn't mean that we should all just be bringing armies full of Dreadnoughts, because things would be quite boring. But again, you know, if you're playing against someone who likes to bring 4 Dreadnoughts and you bring 1 or 2, you've at least offset the balance a little bit, and Dreadnoughts are really cool. The great majority of people like them, so most people are going to run them in their list, so at least it offsets games where people are bringing maybe some more than you. Now, they are very tough for their points, which is, again, their main selling point, so not killing them can be an option. They don't bring that much killing power for their points compared to other things you could buy, so if you can ignore them, that's actually a win for you because your opponent sunk a lot of points into something that's not got as much output. Certainly in some missions where the fact that they're a denial unit doesn't matter, or doesn't matter as much, this is a lot easier as well. They have a low number of melee attacks, which is their biggest weakness, and even when they're in a configuration where they've got 1 power fist, you know, if you charge them so they don't get the extra attack, or if you fight them with the right units, or if you just overwhelm them, this is one of the best ways to deal with Dreadnoughts, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. They do need to be supported as well to avoid that weakness and some of their other weaknesses. So if someone is supporting their Dreadnoughts with other units to mitigate whatever weaknesses they've got, those units will likely be easier to kill than the Dreadnought, so you can also deal with them first before you deal with the Dreadnought itself. They are efficient for their cost, but they are still expensive for one unit, so they're efficient, but they still cost a lot of points for the unit. And if someone is bringing multiple Dreadnoughts, they may well have less stuff than you on the table, which opens up table space for your units to move around. So you can play objectives maybe on the side of the table that's further away from the Dreadnought. You can hide from them and, draw lines of fire to other things with your units where the Dreadnought maybe can't necessarily see the best targets. You can flank, units in a Rhino down a flank. All those kind of things that are part of a standard game of Warhammer are much easier to do when someone's got less coverage of the table than you have. And if someone's bringing multiple Dreadnoughts, their army will certainly be smaller in terms of that. Now, it takes 16.5 las cannon shots on average to kill a Contemptor. Now, that might sound like a lot, but it's not actually that bad. When you think it takes 14 shots to kill a Land Raider in comparison, so yes, the Land Raider's got a chance of exploding. Yes, the Land Raider might take some damage along the way. And yes, 14 is less than 16.5, so I'm not saying Dreadnoughts aren't tough by a long shot, but what I am saying is it's not maybe as far apart as people think it is. A Land Raider being about the same points as an upgun Contemptor as well. So, you can kill these things. 10 plasma gun shots will do 4.5 wounds to them. So 10 plasma guns is not a cheap unit. That is going to run you about 250 points for a unit of 10 tactical support marines with plasma guns. But a unit of 250 points worth of stuff doing 4.5 wounds to a Dreadnought, whilst that is still less than they would do to other equivalent units in the game, is still not a terrible way of dealing with them. They're about the same cost as the Dreadnought. They will kill the Dreadnought easily in 2 turns, or they'll mostly kill it in 1 turn and something else can finish it off. Haywire is also as good as it ever is against, robotic and vehicle targets. Not that Haywire is easy to find, but it is a way of doing it. And instant death melee weapons will kill Dreadnoughts pretty quickly, and obviously the most common instant death melee weapon is the Melter Bomb. So these things, although instant death won't kill Dreadnoughts in 1 shot, as it apparently did last edition, it's still very good. On average it's doing 2 damage, so you're halving the number of hits you need to get through. Alright, so let's talk about how to deal with double gun Dreadnoughts. They're ballistic skill 5, but their damage output is still not amazing for their points. When you think you can get 4 las cannons on a Predator for 150 points or 130 in a squadron, when you think you can get 10 las cannons on infantry for 250 points, they aren't super incredible at shooting things. They're great at surviving and continuing to shoot things over the course of the game, but they're not super incredible for it. So you can consider just shooting other things. If your opponent brought a reasonably fair list, then you can just think about shooting other things. Many weapon combos that Dreadnoughts will bring aren't actually that efficient, and so they are quite easier to ignore. So some of the better Dreadnought combinations, like las cannons and Gravis melters and things like that, are a bit harder to ignore, but there are plenty of configurations on Dreadnoughts that plenty of people playing a reasonable game will play, are much less scary, and it does make them easier to just ignore them. 10 tactical marines in combat with a Dreadnought with 2 guns will tie it up for the entire game. They just don't do any damage if they've not got a melee weapon, so if you do get absolutely anything into combat with one of these Dreadnoughts at all and it's unsupported, it's got no way to get these off it, it won't do anything for the rest of the game, which is another way to deal with this. Elite or high-strength melee units will still kill Dreadnoughts without issues, so anything that is good in melee, particularly things like Thunderhammers and Power Fists, will just kill Dreadnoughts quite quickly. Now, they are still weapon skill 5, but if you've got a character in a unit or any of these units at all, you can just kill them in combat the same way you kill anything else in combat, albeit maybe a little bit tougher, but not too tough. Now, some of the weapons that Dreadnoughts bring as well, so if they are bringing double Gravis Melter or some of the Leviathan weapons, like the Leviathan Melter Gun, Cyclonic Melter Lance, for example, they are also quite short range, so you actually can just avoid them as well. Certainly if you don't take any shots for them for 1 or maybe even 2 turns, you've really reduced the effectiveness of that unit over the course of the game, just like any other short range weapon. Dealing with multi-role Dreadnoughts is a little bit different. So a multi-role Dreadnought being a Dreadnought bringing one gun and one melee weapon, which is quite a common configuration. So they are Ballistic Skill 5 still, but they do have a low range damage output for their points. So if you're paying 200 points for a Dreadnought with a fist and a las cannon, ultimately you're still only bringing 2 las cannons. That's not an awful lot. So lots of the things I said about double gun Dreadnoughts still apply here. You can just ignore them and not kill them if you want to. If they don't ever make it into melee, then the melee weapon is wasted. So they've bought a very expensive range platform. And if they do make it into melee, once they're in melee, their gun is wasted. So they've also wasted points as well. So these are versatile, these Dreadnoughts, and they are a good thing to have in your army. But when you're playing against them, you've got to realise that their offensive effectiveness is actually always going to be half and half and a bit less good. So they are quite good at killing elite infantry, but they've ultimately still only got 3 attacks, maybe 4 on the charge or 4 if you're a Leviathan. They're not very fast at killing anything else, so you can still tie them up with cheaper troops, especially if you get troops that don't run or have high leadership, if they've got a banner nearby, or they've got a couple of characters in the unit, or you've got some special rules or whatever. You can just tie them up for a lot of time for less points than the Dreadnought cost. Dreadnoughts also can't challenge, so if your units have got a hidden weapon like a sergeant with a thunderhammer, or even an independent character in the unit, the Dreadnought won't get through the troops fast enough before that kills it as well. So that's another nice easy way to deal with the Dreadnought, is having them weapons in your units. They're also not fast at killing elite infantry, obviously, either, for the same reasons. So whilst they will go through invulnerable saves without too much problem because of the brutal on their weapons, needing you to pass multiple invulnerable saves, and then if you fail one, you get instant death, they're still not incredible at killing lots of things. So you can overwhelm them. So a good infantry unit, a good elite infantry unit, for example, 5 Fire Drakes, will still have a good go at fighting a Dreadnought, and it will, quite easily pass its saves sometimes on those 3+ saves. The same for Imperial Fist units with these. You can obviously have Emperor's Children elite units that have got Sonic Screamers to give the Dreadnoughts -1 to hit. There's lots of good melee units out there that are quite capable of beating a Dreadnought in combat, or at least having a fair tangle with a Dreadnought for about the same amount of points. So if you can get into combat with it and have a reasonably fair fight, that's also just a way to deal with it, the same way you can deal with anything else. And then lastly, dealing with melee Dreadnoughts. So ultimately, melee Dreadnoughts have got the same drawbacks as all melee things in games of Warhammer. They don't do anything until they get there, and if they never get there, or it takes them too long to get there, they might not have the biggest impact in the game. But they are harder to counter than the other Dreadnoughts to some extent, because the Dreadnought's biggest weakness, in my opinion, is definitely their low number of melee attacks, and this gives them 1 extra melee attack, which just pushes them up to a level where they're going to kill probably enough stuff to guarantee you win in combat, and certainly kill lots of elites in a fight as well. But again, the most potential for actually being wasted in the game because they're melee only as well. So you can ignore them, or you can just avoid them. You can run away from them. You can just play a different part of the table. You can refuse flank in deployment. There's lots of ways to avoid melee units that, you will have all done lots of times over your gaming career, and these are no different. They're still not that good at dealing with basic infantry. So whereas 10 Tactical Marines will probably only tie them up for 3 turns, that's still 3 turns. And that'll be, 1 of each person's combat phase. So 2 turns of the Dreadnought player's game stuck in combat with a 100-point tactical unit, if that was what you were going to do. And that will buy you some time. That is still a reasonably good way to do it. Now, it's obviously better if you've got some way to stop that unit from running again, but tying them up is still a valid tactic, although a bit less good. They still can't challenge, so that also still applies as it does to multi-role Dreadnoughts. And you can still overwhelm them with elite infantry. Now, I would probably want to be going in with bigger units of elite infantry, but there's lots of people who run units of 10 elite Terminators, and they will also kill a Dreadnought just as easily. Maybe not as easily, but they will kill a Dreadnought just like they kill other things. You just might lose a couple of models along the way, but ultimately when it comes down to it, that's still not that big a problem. And they are slow-ish, so, difficult terrain is an issue for contemptors, at least Leviathans move through cover, but they are quite slow. they are, well, normal speed is probably a better way to put it, but, you are able to avoid them the same way you can avoid any other melee units as well. Now let's look at some Legion-specific tips for dealing with Dreadnoughts. So you will see straight away from looking at this list, there's a lot of them. And this is good because although Dreadnoughts are very good, there are lots of Legions that have got ways to improve their ability to kill Dreadnoughts. So Night Lords and Iron Warriors, +1 to wound when shooting them, which makes the inefficient shooting suddenly less inefficient. And yes, Dreadnoughts are still tougher than other equivalent things would be, even with these bonuses factored in. But if you can get a unit shooting at a Dreadnought and killing it reasonably profitably, it's still okay. You're still doing well. You're still not beholden to that Dreadnought for the rest of the game, and it's ruined your game. You can't play around it. Just things that make them easier to kill puts them more onto a level where your game's going to be fun. Ultramarines, likewise, +1 to hit on shooting, have the same effect. Iron Hands with Graviton Shredders. Graviton Shredders will handily destroy Dreadnoughts. Dark Angels, Emperor's Children, Space Wolves, World Eaters, and Salamanders in particular, all of their elite melee options are good for the reasons we've already talked about, but these guys all buff or have the right options to kill Dreadnought easily. So Dark Angels, Cenobium, Terminators with instant death weapons, Emperor's Children, able to give them -1 to hit, able to alter the combat rolls, and also bring in murderous strike weapons. Space Wolves just having really good elites in combat, possibly a +1 weapon skill. Same for World Eaters, another attack, just pushing them up to the point where their elite units are able to kill the Dreadnought. And Salamanders bring in Fire Drakes, which have got both survivability and the ability to hurt Dreadnoughts as well. Blood Angels melee likewise, and Blood Angels even can potentially kill Dreadnoughts with volume attacks. So even a big unit of Tactical Marines with chain bayonets, because they're wounding Dreadnoughts on a 5 with a shred reroll, will actually do enough damage to kill a Dreadnought over a couple of turns. So as well as tying them up with those sort of cheapish Tactical Marines, you'll actually kill a Dreadnought over a couple of turns as well. Word Bearers, particularly good at dealing with Dreadnoughts. So Gal Vorbach are immune to instant death because they're toughness 5, and Dreadnoughts are generally strength 9. They're also bringing Murderous as well for those instant death. And corrupted units won't run away from Dreadnoughts either, so the things we've talked about for tying them up, Word Bearers corrupted units are particularly good for being good at that. White Scars, Golden Keshig on jet bikes, these are one of my favourite ways. So a unit of 6 Golden Keshig will run you in the mid-200s points, and they will kill a Contemptor on the charge on averages, which is just really cool. Now, whether you think that unit is a good unit or not is a different thing, and certainly something I'm going to cover in a video, but these guys are an absolute missile that will just quite happily kill a Dreadnought, and even if they do die in return, you've basically traded the same number of points, which is cool. Imperial Fists, Assault Cannons are really good, will shred Dreadnoughts really handily, and they also bring the 3+ invulnerable save shields, and also Solarite Gauntlets to the party as well to make wounding even those Leviathans on 2s a little bit easier. So lots of Legions, bonuses, or unique units and different things are all set up in a way in which it helps them kill Dreadnoughts. So to summarise, there are lots of ways to deal with Dreadnoughts, whether you avoid them, ignore them, shoot something else, or whether you try to beat them in melee or tie them up. There's lots of different options you've got. You just have to realise which of those options you're going to use in a given game, and know which options are actually available to you. Dreadnoughts are awesome, and they're good in the game. They look cool. Everybody loves Dreadnoughts for the most part, which means there's always going to be a lot of them used on the tabletop. I would be surprised if you play most games where there isn't at least one Dreadnought in them when you play Horus Heresy. So make sure you bring ways to deal with Dreadnoughts. That's the best way of not having bad games where you feel like it was ruined because your opponent brought some Dreadnoughts. The things that deal with Dreadnoughts that we've just talked about are also good at dealing with lots of other things in the game. It's not like you have to bring an anti-Dreadnought army. We're just talking about bringing normal things you would put in your army anyway, and making sure that you've got enough of them to be able to deal with Dreadnoughts when they're on the table. So this doesn't make your list building hard or complicated. It doesn't have to be a super smart thing. Just make sure you bring enough things to deal with the Dreadnoughts you will inevitably fight. And help other people to do that as well. So one of the best ways to make sure that opponents and other people in your gaming group don't have bad games against Dreadnoughts is to give them the same advice that you've seen here. Point them at this video, or just tell them what their options are for dealing with Dreadnoughts, because it's not immediately obvious to everyone, but when it is, you'll have better games for it. And also as well, don't spam Dreadnoughts is a thing. Now, they are undoubtedly very good, and the more you spam them, the more their strengths become apparent. If you are going to do that, make sure that your opponent or the event organizer is okay with it. You know, at least if you let your opponent know, they can bring something that might be able to take those Dreadnoughts on. So that's the end of the video. I hope that has given you lots of ideas on how you can deal with Dreadnoughts, and I hope that you can see that although they are very good, they're not the, game-ruining, super scary things that they're sometimes made out to be in various corners of the internet. If you enjoyed the content, please do leave me a like and a subscribe, and if you've got any comments at all, please leave me those comments or your feedback in YouTube down below. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.